Hello, everyone. Welcome to the semi-annual Peter Green Lecture on the Modern Middle East, for which we invite a distinguished lecturer. And in this case, it's Professor John Chalcraft, who came over from England, the London School of Economics, to join us. I'd like to say hello to our online audience. This is being simulcast and recorded. We have a tradition in Middle East studies. We don't do introductions. All of you should have a sheet in front of you here with the bio and the abstract of the talk. However, I do like John's title, and as well as the titles of his book, so I will mention those briefly. John Chalcraft is Associate Professor in the History and Politics of Empire/Imperialism at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And the first book of his that I read was called The Striking Cabbies of Cairo and Other Stories, Crafts and Guilds in Egypt, 1863 to 1914, which was wonderful. And then when his second book came out, which I also assigned to my graduate class, The Invisible Cage, Syrian Migrant Workers in Lebanon, which came out from Stafford University Press, really impressed me and my students for its combination of theoretical insight and empirical heft. And that has become a hallmark of his work, and especially of this rather hefty book that just came out, and this will be the first public talk on this book, so we're honored to have him here with us. Popular Politics in the Making of the Modern Middle East, Cambridge University Press. Let me just say that my graduate class enjoyed about a 3-hour discussion of this book yesterday with John. So not enough can be said about it in just the lecture today. But I do want to emphasize that it is a landmark contribution to the field of Middle East studies because it forces us to rethink the history of the modern Middle East from the perspective of transgressive actions by subaltern groups for the most part, but other groups as well, who sort of break the rules and cause change. And this was theorized in the book in a really wonderful introduction that also takes a magisterial look at the historiography of the field, and which by itself, the introduction would be a very important addition to the way we think about the Middle East. What John does is, we all do this, we try to step away from the essentialism of Orientalism, but then what do we do after that? And he tries to thread the needle between what he calls a discursive and, my word, materialist kind of deterministic perspectives. And we'll hear more about that today. And the book is full of case studies, ranging from Morocco to Yemen, and from the 18th to 2011. So I can't wait to hear more, and thank you very much for coming. Please help me in welcoming John Chalcraft.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bashara, for that very nice introduction. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for coming. I want to thank the Middle East Studies program at Brown University and Barbara Oberketter and the Peter Green Fund for funding this. It's really an honor to be here. I'm coming out sort of blinking into the glare of publicity, having been in the tunnel and the cave of writing and rewriting, and finally this book came out a couple of weeks ago. So it's a privilege to be able to stand up, and thank you so many of you for coming. So the book is a history of protest in the Middle East and North Africa since the late 18th century to the present. It draws on a wide range of secondary literature in English, French, and Arabic, as well as a variety of primary sources, archival sources, and especially I looked at memoirs, autobiographies, and treaties written by activists themselves. The book takes up a great variety of protest, from individual and collective expressions of dissent through to more continuous forms of petitioning or socio-political movements, to attempts to seize, in more rugged and subaltern fashion, liberty against the law, to mass uprisings and revolutions. There are Islamist movements, nationalist movements, movements around labor, women, liberalism, and democracy. And you find in the book armed struggle, other movements based around institutional disruption, and other movements that advance through persuasion. At the center of the book is this idea of unruly collective action or transgressive mobilization, which is this idea of how new forms of collective solidarity are formed in challenges to authority, and I'll flesh that out. But the book's in 4 parts, goes back to the late 18th century, and it has many case studies which are oriented around episodes of contention. It's written against neo-Orientalism and the way neo-Orientalism has dismissed popular protest as recalcitrance or fanaticism, and the, by now, familiar critique in Middle East studies of the cultural essentialism and exceptionalism that we find in neo-Orientalism. It's also written against top-down accounts of politics and political history and their lack of attention to issues of consent and resistance. On the other hand, the book stands on the shoulders of a long tradition of historical sociology and the critique that historical sociology mounted of cultural essentialism and exceptionalism. But the book also takes issue with the socio-economic determinism and modernist telos that we find in historical sociology. And I also draw a great deal from post-colonialism's critiques of modernist meta-narrative, but I take issue with the erasure of subaltern voice that we find in post-colonialism, the erasure of the everyday concerns and struggles and practices in regard to subalterns, which we find in post-colonialism, the way discourse gets treated as an overwhelming mechanism of social control, and the way the subaltern is ultimately spectralized by this kind of treatment and the forms, and the way this ultimately leads into political disengagement. So the aim instead of this is to write a rich political history from below, which attends to issues of hegemony, consent, dissent, contentious mobilization, and the ways in which popular politics was at stake through the making and the unmaking of the region's political dispensations. In this lecture, I just want to do 2 things. First, to give an overview of what's in the book and tell you what its main historical arguments are. And then, because there is an attempt to ground this in a certain kind of conceptual framework around popular politics, I'll take the second half of the lecture to explore some of the key themes by which that conceptual framework is constructed: hegemonic contraction, unruly collective action, intellectual labor, and so on. So to begin with the overview of what's in the book and its main historical arguments. The first part of the book is called Part 1. It goes from 1798 to 1914. It's entitled Millenarianism, Renewal, Justice, Rights, and Reform. It has a number of case studies. It looks at the uprising against the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt, 1798 to 1801. It looks at decades of struggle against French colonialism in Algeria after 1830. It looks at millenarian uprisings in Egypt between the 1810s and the 1860s. It looks at Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi's Islamic revivalist and state-building project in Algeria in the 1830s and 40s, and a variety of other studies, the commoner uprisings against taxation in the Mashriq, the Arab East, in the 1820s and 40s, including the remarkable popular republican movement of Tanius Shaheen, on the Christian muleteer on Mount Lebanon in 1858 to 1860. It looks at tribes, Sufis, pretenders, and millenarians in Morocco, the millenarian Mahdiya of Sudan in the 1880s. It looks at strikes between 1860 and the 1900s before unions, parties, and socialism. And it looks at the Arabi movement in Egypt, 1881 to 2, and the constitutional movement in Istanbul in 1908, as well as workers and peasants in Egypt around the turn of the century. The main context and the main explanatory device, the way of thinking and situating these cases within an explanatory sort of context, within circumstances transmitted from the past, is in this period is state self-strengthening under pressure from European imperialism. It's not primarily about direct colonial rule or about world economic integration. Instead, it's different vectors of the extraction, fiscal extraction, regulation and conscription, or new kinds of centralization or regulation, and also weakness, corruption and indebtedness, especially in countries like Morocco and then Egypt after 1876, which provide authoritative vectors within which popular mobilization is conceived. In this context, you have movements that sought to replace the state entirely in a revolutionary fashion with a new kind of political community. And that was done not under nationalist banners, the book argues, but under banners of Islamic revival and Sufi and heterodox and millenarian forms of Islamism. You have other kinds of movements that sought to win concessions from the state or to carve out spheres of autonomy in defense of rights or custom. And these were done under the banners not of labor socialism or liberalism, but under the banners of powerful living traditions that existed in regard to the Sultan's justice, notions of Ottoman statecraft, notions of rights and just shares, and ideas about custom, both tribal and urban. And there are other movements undertaken by urban reformists who sought to lodge principles of representation in the state, but they lacked mass constituencies before the First World War. One of the main arguments in this section is that powerful traditions of popular protest in the 19th century were not half-formed or deviant versions of more complete European models. They were not backward, pre-political, or archaic. Instead, they were built around living and changing and diverse Islamic traditions, Ottoman statecraft, and custom. Now, in terms of how such movements played a role, well, sometimes it's not entirely a rosy picture. Movements could draw in colonial violence, they could encounter brutal repression, and they could end in sectarian conflict, as did the uprising of Tanya Shaheen on Mount Lebanon in 1860, in a kind of a portent of what happened in Syria after 2011. But on the more positive side, movements could blunt extraction, fiscal extraction by the powerful. They could secure rights and just shares for commoners. They could enact justice against local exploiters. They cut against corruption. They drew on and thus entrenched new forms of state centralization and bureaucratization. And they temporarily, at least, generated new forms of statehood and political community. And in 1881-2, and in 1908 in Istanbul, and in 1905-11 in Iran, they temporarily lodged new principles of representation in the state. So in this part of the book, against dismissal, against top-down accounts, against modernist condescension and post-colonial indifference, the argument is that contentious mobilization and popular politics was fundamentally at stake in changing political dispensations during the long 19th century. Part 2 of the book runs from 1914 to 1952. It's entitled Patriotism, Liberalism, Armed Struggle and Ideology. And the case studies include quite a lot of attention to the rugged armed struggles under banners of nation and Islam that broke out between 1911 and 1939 in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Morocco, and Palestine. They include the mass insurrection in Egypt of 1919, the Young Algerians and Masali el-Hajj in Algeria, the labor movement in Egypt, nationalist Shia workers and peasants in Iraq, the National Bloc in Syria, women's movements in Egypt, and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Here, the main explanatory context has to do less with any historical escalator of socio-economic change and transformation, and it has much more to do with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and direct and invasive forms of imperialism that the region encountered very dramatically after 1911, and then growing crises of the semi-independent states and their politicians and leaderships. These dynamics at the level of the state and of colonial power broke the existing state framework and imposed a different one. They implied invasive new forms of state power, whether in the Rif Mountains under the Spanish in Morocco or the Jebel Druze in Syria under the French. They generated powerful new forms of exclusion, whether Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine or Italian settler colonialism in Libya. They also offered alliances to those ready to seize them, such as the Arab Revolt of 1916 to 18. During this period, movements demanded independence, above all under nationalist banners, which blended and joined hands with notions of independence conceived in Islamic terms. Movements increasingly demanded not just the Sultan's justice, but reform of the whole social system, whether in terms of Islam, socialism, or liberalism. And new struggles drew on older organizational forms and traditions of protest and forms of moral economy, but they reformulated them in new terms. The Sufi order and the guild were replaced by unions and mass societies. I argue that the interwar period was no dress rehearsal for later. Independence was so much emphasized in the early part of this period, not because these were superficial political struggles that lacked socio-economic content, but because political community and its radical transformation really was at stake in the early part of this period. Nor, I argue, were these movements a kind of modernist graft onto a backward population. Instead, nationalism came to the fore because it was able to hegemonize diverse constituencies, living traditions and ideas, including religious and jihad traditions. And the development of new ideological forms drew on powerful traditions of protest and reformulated them. The generation of 1919, as it were, did not achieve national independence in the Arabic-speaking world, and the transformation of the system on socialist, Islamic, or liberal lines was not achieved. And in many cases, uprisings were brutally crushed. French violence in Syria between 1925 and 27 actually resembles some of the violence meted out by the Assad regime against the uprising after 2011. On the more positive side, these movements made national independence the key stake in relations with European powers. They made national aspirations hegemonic in the social formation as a whole. They changed the terms of colonial rule concretely on the ground in several cases, from direct to indirect, in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. They pushed forward state centralization in the Rif Mountains, and they stitched tribes into state formation in a new and innovative way in Iraq and Jordan. They made social reform, whether in regards to women or labor relations or the economy, central issues. And they developed new vehicles of mass organization, syndicates, unions, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. And they contributed in a major way over time to the unsustainability of the semi-colonial order. Part 3 of the book takes us from 1952 to 1976, and it deals with national independence, guerrilla war, and social revolution. Some of the cases include Nasser's revolutionary coup in Egypt in 1952, and similar coups in Iraq in 58, North Yemen in 62, and Libya in 1969, and attempted coups in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s and 60s. I track also the armed struggles in Algeria, South Yemen, and among Palestinians from 1954 to the 1970s. I look at the rise of Baathism in Syria, strikes and protests in various parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and leftist movements in Lebanon until 1976. Here, the main explanatory context has less to do with any escalator of socio-economic change, and it certainly has nothing to do with the sort of Cold War thesis about how the strains of modernization were driving Middle East populations unable to cope with things like rural and urban migration to extremist ideologies. Instead, the book sees the key explanatory context in terms of the crisis of the colonially controlled, partly liberal political order that was bequeathed by the interwar years. National independence and social reform were burning issues by the 1940s, but the generation of 1919 had not delivered, and this was a galvanizing crisis that stirred mass mobilization. So in this context, movements aim to bring about national independence, and they aim to drive through social and economic reform and the redistribution of wealth. Now, one of the points I make in this section is that although this period has quite dramatic forms of mobilization, but we must not miss how many of the new forms of collective action actually worked as a kind of a displacement of forms of mass mobilization, of, say, the Muslim Brotherhood or independent labor union organizing. Because while mass mobilization during the interwar period into the 50s in places like Iraq generated crises in the semi-colonial state, the coup de grace, as it were, was often delivered by vanguards. Revolutionary coups and armed struggles were led by relatively small numbers of those committed to direct action and the gun. And they had little time often for ideology or what they saw as the bickering and the divisiveness of liberal politicians. A certain kind of vanguardism was at work. Now, on the one side, this gives the lie to the idea of a kind of linear rise of mass politics on and on, the kind of model that you get when you read a Charles Tilley on popular contention in Britain and how, you gradually have a linear growth of mass politics. Actually, there's a way in which mass mobilization and continuous organization of subaltern social groups by organized members, often drawn from intellectual or middle classes, that can be shunted aside, and to some extent it was. And in some respects, the new authoritarianism that develops by the 1970s has an elective affinity with the vanguardist forms of activist practice that helped push through national independence and socio-economic reform. On the other hand, the movements of this period had major achievements. They brought about national independence in a way that their forebears hadn't, and they contributed to real social and economic redistribution, and those things can hardly be contested. Anyway, from the point of view of the book, for better or for worse, contentious mobilization is constitutive, not epiphenomenal during these years. The final part of the book, part 4, runs from 1977 to 2011. It's entitled Islamism, Revolution, Uprisings, and Liberalism. And it begins with the uprising in Egypt in 1977, and also strike action and left protest in Egypt in the 70s and 80s. I look at Shi'ism in Iraq, from pamphlets to Mujahideen, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria till 1982, and then in Egypt, and then the militant splinters from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, jihad movements. I look at the Iranian Revolution, Lebanon and Hezbollah, Salafi Wahhabism and taking on the far enemy. Look at the reform movement in Iran in the 1990s, the independence intifada in Lebanon, 2005, the return of liberal and labor protest in Egypt in the 2000s, the BDS movement for Palestinian rights, and the Arab uprisings and the fate of liberals in Egypt. Here, the main explanatory context has less to do with a specific trajectory of globalization or of neoliberal capitalist development. Instead, I look at the increasing incapacity of the formerly revolutionary republics to win the consent of their populations, and the attempts by states such as Saudi Arabia to legitimate themselves on revamped Salafi Wahhabi lines. In this context, the actions of authorities count. They rolled back social and economic rights. They drew back from pan-Arabism and third worldism. They failed to bring either democracy or prosperity in many cases, especially in the formerly revolutionary republics. They provoked many by violence, torture, and police humiliation. And the sponsorship of Salafi Wahhabism, an absolutist and sectarian form of Islam, by the Saudi royal house in order to justify absolutist rule, promoted a previously rejected form of Islamism in many parts of the region. While invasion and occupation from without, Israeli settler colonization, and the machinations of other external powers, notably Russia, have generated major dissenting constituencies in the region. So in this context, movements have aimed to replace the secular corrupted state with an Islamic state, whether in Shia, Sunni modernist or Salafi Wahhabi colours, or they've sought to throw off occupation in both Islamic and secular nationalist letterings. In one case, that of the BDS movement, aim is taken at settler colonialism by a translocal, radically democratic and post-nationalist project. Movements such as Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, turned their attention to targeting the far enemy, i.e. the United States. In 2011, we saw uprisings that sought to bring down corrupted regimes on the basis of universal forms of popular sovereignty, bread, dignity, and freedom. Other more reformist movements aimed to reform state and society on Islamic and pious lines. They sought to assert, restore, or recover social and economic rights against heavy threats, to push for the rights of women in very different ways, or to push back against dictatorship, bringing liberal, representative, and democratic principles and human rights norms to bear in the state. So if we look at this as a glass half empty, we might say, well, these movements have contributed directly and indirectly to sectarian conflict in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Algeria in the 1990s. We might say they've often been brutally repressed at great cost. They have not halted settler colonization in Israel-Palestine. In many cases, they've been unable to prevent the growth of the security state, and they've contributed to revolutions that have devoured their children, as in Iraq. And the new religious politics has brought about new forms of social conservatism, with all the implications this has for restrictions on sexual, gender, and women's freedoms. More positively, perhaps, Hezbollah did succeed in terminating Israel's long occupation of South Lebanon in 2000. Others, from Bahrain to Egypt, have kept alive the idea that human rights, representative institutions, and democratic forms should be promoted in the face of dictatorship, corruption, and monarchy. Other movements have contributed to the making of Islamic forms of democracy, both in theory and practice. And we've seen in Tunisia since 2011 positive liberal democratic outcomes in the wake of mass uprisings and tenacious organized contention, outcomes currently threatened by sectarianism in Salafi coloring. Others, of course, have protected public sector and industrial workers against deteriorating pay and conditions and kept the social question alive even in an age of neoliberalism. In the Arab world in the present, the book argues that the idea of the Islamic State has not been able to become hegemonic in the social formation as a whole, either because it's been conceived too narrowly or because there are very broad constituencies that are profoundly opposed to it. And it's this difficult impasse which drives liberals and frightened minorities into the hands of authoritarian rulers and excludes and makes more militant Islamists themselves, is central to the contemporary dilemmas of the region. And this is a dilemma that has everything to do with the contentious mobilization and popular politics, which this book is centrally concerned. So it should be clear by now that the book is aimed at getting various historiographical traditions to take popular politics seriously. It's neither about fanaticism, nor is it irrelevant, as in top-down accounts, nor is it voiceless, as in much of post-colonialism. And nor is it, as a historical materialist might say, mere populism. But if I'm to advance this aim, I need to develop the theme of popular politics in a slightly more conceptual detail, and I would like to use the last, how long do I have, 20 minutes or so, to do just that. And the inspiration for doing this is the writings of the Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci, and especially his full-throated analysis of politics, of culture, of hegemony in the dominant bloc, subaltern social groups, and projects of moral, political, and intellectual leadership. I mean, Gramsci's the one who, in the historically materialist tradition, speaks about subjectivity, politics, and so on. And I try to push forward a political reading of Gramsci. But I signal at the beginning the sort of tantalizing phrase that gestures towards what I'm interested in when I speak about unruly collective action or transgressive mobilization. And that's this thing that Palestinians said to Sonia Nimmer in the late 1980s when she was researching oral histories of the uprising of the late 1930s. Palestinians said to her, well, quote, "The people defied the authorities and took matters into their own hands." This was, to me, a very provocative sort of a phrase, and I wanted to gradually add analytic flesh to what that might mean. And because it seems to me that whether authorities like it or not, and they usually do not, ordinary people, meaning those who are excluded from the transacted and official politics of the established political field, persist in seeking to participate and sometimes try to take matters into their own hands. And in the book, I emphatically wanted to argue that this is not a gift of Europe to the world. it has a long pre- and early modern history, this unruly collective action. I mean, of course, it was spectacularly on display in the Arab uprisings, whereas these uprisings didn't come from nowhere. I hope that should be clear from the book. But the demand for the regime to fall, the mobilization of millions, the extension of slogans of bread, dignity, and freedom, decentralized modes of organization and leaderfulness, the determined occupations of public space, pitched battles with security forces, and so on, and actual success in toppling dictators, these were the vectors of unruly collective action and transgressive mobilization. But what's so important to me about this concept is that there's nothing new about it. It's not the result of a long trajectory of change rooted in a principle of socioeconomic development. So, for example, if we skip back to Cairo, 1798, during the uprising, here's what the famous chronicler of the day said about the uprising. This is al-Jabarti. He said, in Cairo, a well-known cleric came forward, quote, mounted on a steed in extraordinary military fashion, leading crowds from the Al-Hussein quarter. The crowd became huge and full of the poor and those of low status, ruffians and, quote, inhabitants of lodgings, in the ever-critical language of al-Jabarti. They gathered in front of the Al-Hussein Mosque, the Al-Azhar Seminary, and the chief judge's house to demand what faith, law, and justice required. A perfumer among them, who Jabarti says, quote, was dressed in the guise of a cleric, with a vest and a waistcloth, came forward calling out to the people, incited them and exclaimed, Muslims, God is most great. The clerics have commanded you to kill the infidels. Make ready stalwarts and strike them everywhere, unquote. Jabarti grumbled about a particular leader called al-Maghribi, and this is the part which is the striking phrase. He says, quote, he interfered in things which do not concern him, and he appeared in town like the Pasha and the Kethhuda and the Mamluks. What is he that he appoints himself without having been appointed by anybody? It is civil strife which turns any ignoble bird into a vulture, especially when the rabble riots and the mob and riffraff rises, unquote. So here is a vivid, if sour and conservative, description of the transgressive seizure from below of political and doctrinal agency. And we see this throughout the region. I mean, take this case from 1821, a tax uprising on Mount Lebanon. And there were demands that the people, the commoners, would elect deputies who would negotiate with the authorities. And they also spoke about the interests of the country, maslahat al-bilad, which was quite a dramatic thing to do in the face of Ottoman authorities who didn't think the commoners had any business in determining what the interests of the country were. So the Ottoman governor addresses the people in 1821. He says, well, the notables are corrupting the land. They're using, quote, intrigue, cunning, and deception to disturb the peace. The commoners, on the other hand, put themselves in a perplexing way at odds with the august authority, order, and security of the emir, because they were ignorant, base, stubborn, disobedient, bold, and deviant. They had entered a domain for which they were utterly unfit and unprepared. They were easily crushed. They were not, quote, an army ready for battle, and they should give up on folly. As an Ottoman official declared, subjects, quote, held in compassion and protection should return to your villages and preoccupy yourselves with your own affairs and render what is required of you. So here, clearly in what Coup usefully called the prose of counterinsurgency, we have another indication from above of this moment of transgressive mobilization. And we find it again, say, in the oil fields of Aramco in the 1950s, where Palestinians and Yemenis and Egyptians and others, as studied by Vitalis, are deported for what the Saudi authorities called unauthorized political activity, and so on. And we have it right down to the present. So the idea is that unruly collective action involves moments when those ordinarily excluded from political society, quote, this is, I suppose it's could be a quote, but they cease to delegate authority to existing power holders or established political actors. They delegate political agency to new and previously unrecognized or marginal actors, and they create new forms of solidarity, and they become a new force to be reckoned with. It's partly when Gramsci writes about the long labor that brings into being a new collective will, and it changes the balance of political forces. And such forms are exasperating to power holders precisely because they're both new and they're unexpected, they're misunderstood, and they offer a challenge. So that's something about unruly collective action, transgressive mobilization, which runs through the book and doesn't depend for its instantiation on some principle at work, a modernist teleology, if you will. A second concept that I'd like to mention that runs also through the book is what I call hegemonic contraction. And in this history throughout, we find these powerful generative moments when authorities fail in major undertakings, they lose consent and authority, they become mere power holders, wielders of domination without hegemony, and dissent becomes widespread. And this we have throughout this history, from the derelictions of the Mamluks in the protection of Egypt in 1798, as so swingingly criticized by al-Jabarti, right through to the major blow to the authority of the Saudi state after 1990. Because in 1990 to 1991, the Saudi state accepted, and Bin Baz, the senior Wahhabi cleric, condoned the deployment of around 500,000 American troops on Saudi soil as part of the operation to oust the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. This factor shook the status quo and divided opinion like nothing in the modern history of the kingdom. Francois Bergat, speaks of, quote, the collapse of the Islamic legitimacy of the Saudi guardians of the holy places of Islam immediately after the 1990 alliance with the United States against Iraq, and the resulting emergence of a powerful Islamist opposition to the monarchy in Riyadh. Certainly, this crisis is probably the best available explanation for the timing of the Sahwa contention in Saudi Arabia, so well studied by Stéphane Lacroix. So that's one example. Others, and I make a play in the book of how the failures of the generation of 1919 galvanize action among the generation of 1948, as it were. I'll mention something from the memoirs of a fighter who was mobilized to join the ranks of the Palestine Liberation Organization after the defeat of the Arab states in 1967. So he was a Lebanese journalist, he was sitting in Beirut, he was a student, and he said, well, the 1967 war, the defeat of the Arab states at the hands of Israel, was a, quote, major shock to the whole Arab nation. It, quote, woke people up to what was going on around them. This defeat, he says, took me from just a general political interest to a direct political commitment. He says that he had started, in fact, quote, to conduct research in political magazines with a disgust for mere rhetoric and a desire for effectiveness and direct action. He writes, quote, everyone started trying to plan a way or a political method or an idea to find a solution here or there. Suddenly, all eyes were riveted on Palestine and the Palestinian resistance that rose up on the 1st of January 1965. Quote, I was among those young men that were greatly impressed by these fidei, i.e. guerrilla actions, and I followed the news of them in the press before I became an openly proclaimed proponent of armed struggle. So we notice the politicization of this student was not through the presence of a pre-existing socio-economic grievance, which then translated into political action, but amid a shock at the dereliction of existing authorities, a journey into politics as a result, and a subsequent adherence to a given political leadership and activism, form of activism. So this is partly what I mean by hegemonic contraction. It's a theme that runs through the book, and it's this idea of the way in which older forms and established forms of authority are undermined. And I argue that deserves an analysis in its own right. There are several other key themes. One is intellectual labor. It runs through the book. Another has to do with how ideas and models for collective action get appropriated in unruly ways across borders. Another has to do with the importance of normative commitments in mobilization. And a final theme has to do with more practical forms of leadership, organization, strategies, and tactics. These themes are all ways to try to analyze how the sorts of active agencies that appear at moments of hegemonic contraction get established and worked through. The goal, of course, is to make sense of them, but without explaining them away, to allow for a context, hegemonic contraction, but to allow for the role of agency, which could make a radical difference to the new kinds of mobilizing projects that come into being. And, I mean, in terms of intellectual labour, well, this is the work done by, often to begin with, marginal intellectuals who develop visions, who develop ways of diagnosing problems in society, ways they prognosticate courses of action for how people should behave. They define forms of oppression in very particular ways. And this sort of labour plays a role from the legal concepts of jihad that are operative in the first half of the 19th century, through to Islamic revivalism in Sufi clothes of an Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, through to the Millenarianism of the Mahdiya in Sudan, and right through to politicized Shiism or notions of radical democracy or Salafi Wahhabism in the present. I mean, one of the most remarkable developments on this front is the fact that to begin with, is the trajectory, if you look at the trajectory of politicized Shiism in the region since 1958. I mean, it's a remarkable moment when after the coup, the revolutionary coup in Iraq, when the political field is dominated by, first of all, the Communist Party. It's the largest communist party in the Arab world. You have secularists, you have national democrats, you have Kurds, you have nationalists, you have pan-Arabists. But politics in Islamist clothes is nowhere to be found, except there's a group of Shia clerics who decide to work out a vision, even without a mass base, without a political extension. They decide to work out what an Islamic state would look like, and they include the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is circulating between Qom, Najaf, Karbala, and these shrine cities. You have clerics figuring out what an Islamic state would look like. Well, you would have the rule of the jurisprudent. Would you have a council of guardians to make sure that the legislation proposed by elected bodies would conform with the precepts of Islamic law? And they build up a whole idea, even at a time when it seems absurd. I mean, think of Iran, one of the richest, most powerful and developing states in the region, very secular in the 1960s and 70s. There's this intellectual labour going on which proposes an alternative. And in Iran in particular, you have this figure, Ali Shariati, who's a school teacher, who goes to Paris in the early 1960s. He encounters revolutionary Marxism and Third Worldism, and he redefines in many ways what Shiism is. He says, well, actually the essence of Shiism is revolutionary activism against injustice. And so, and this can have an appeal beyond the constituencies that might listen to the clerics. Anyway, this is a pattern of intellectual labour that then informs, it provides a basis of cohesion, it can motivate, it can prognosticate, but it plays a role in the Iranian Revolution of 78 to 79. So, you'll be pleased to hear I'm really going to go on for another 5 minutes. But, this is one of the themes that you have through the book. And there's another one that has to do with how activists appropriate in quite an unruly way models for collective action across borders. Perhaps I'll just give one example. I mean, one quite dramatic example is simply the idea of the revolutionary coup, because this is what Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers pull off on the 23rd of July 1952. Well, just the fact that they do that gives the idea to other free officers or would-be free officers in other parts of the Arab world. And I won't quote you here, but there's one of the figures who begins the planning in Iraq for the revolutionary coup that takes place in 1958. He begins, and he says in his memoirs, it was Nasser's inspiration, and we started planning in September, 2 months after Nasser's coup in 52 for such a coup in Iraq. And then, of course, this same model informs North Yemen in 62, and it emphatically informs what happens in Libya in 1969, which is this idea of how you could seize power within the state. But the book is also, I found ultimately it's very difficult to even define a movement without some notion of normative commitment. It seems that if a movement becomes merely opportunistic, if it becomes merely an interest group, if it becomes merely self-interested, and movements are very often accused of being just that, but if that really comes to be the case, then in some ways it's not a movement anymore. I found normative commitment to be quite fundamental, but especially in sustaining activists at moments of high risk and at moments of great danger, or at moments when the temptations or seductions of power are present. And let me just give you one example, because I think it's very dramatic. And it's this: you have the Mahdi of Sudan. I mean, he's a well-known figure, but he discloses his mission in 1881, that he is the expected deliverer and he will bring about a reign of justice on earth. He's the son of a boat builder. He's been an ascetic, he's been a Sufi, but he's someone from humble origins. He's supported by a tribe of cattle herders. And he receives a letter from a representative of the largest empire in the world, the British Empire. He receives a letter from General Gordon himself on March 1884, and it says, okay, we will appoint you the Sultan of Kordofan. And it urges him to release the European prisoners. It sends him a red robe of honor and a tarbouch. And this is the reply from the expected deliverer, Mohammed Ahmed of Dongola. He says, quote, "Know that I am the expected Mahdi, the successor of the Apostle of God. Thus I have no need of the Sultanate, nor of the kingdom of Kordofan or elsewhere, nor of the wealth of this world and its vanity. I am but the slave of God, guiding unto God and to what is with him. As for the gift which you have sent us, may God reward you well for your goodwill and guide you to the right. It is returned to you herewith." So that's the kind of thing I mean by how a normative commitment can provide a kind of transcendent morale to a movement, meaning a determination that would then overcome various obstacles and issues. And I won't go into what I say about more practical forms of leadership, organization, strategies and tactics, but it's another theme that's important in the book, and I want to evaluate and show how it varies and how it matters in the fate and fortunes of movements. So overall, the book obviously makes a pitch for the importance of popular politics in the history of the region and in changing forms of hegemony and domination. And I've tried to lay out some of the main historical arguments in the book to tell you a bit about what's in it and to begin to flesh out what it means to talk about popular politics. But what I assert is that we need to write this history with the protest left in. We can't dismiss it, as in Neo-Orientalism. We can't ignore it, as in top-down power institutional accounts that only look at elites and institutional power. We must challenge the post-colonial indifference to the protests and passions and lives of the many. And it's also unsatisfactory to try to explain this history through a linear and materialist version of capitalist development. It doesn't do justice to agency, culture, and politics itself. The attempt, therefore, here is to recover a more engaged and political form of history writing in a context where cultural and discursive histories have had the initiative. And the problem is that these have led to a kind of detachment, and the possibilities for understanding and analyzing resistance have been occluded. One might say more widely that protest is often about real problems of ordinary people, and it can hold out the hope for positive transformation. But it can be the worst of times as well as the best of times. And it's neither an angel nor a devil, but it's a human construction and thus regularly flawed. This, finally, is a popular politics. It's not about populism. It's about the persistent attempts by ordinary people excluded from the political realm to refuse such a situation of exclusion and attempt to play a role in the policies, rules, and forms of coercion that they find themselves dominated by. It's a vital and enduring theme, and it will be for many years to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
You want to handle your own question?
Okay, I might sit down if that's...
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
fantastic. I mean, this is a huge and impressive project, so congratulations on completing it in the recent publication. As you work through this charting of popular politics, I'm wondering, even despite the fact that you're pushing against certain types of materialist histories, to what extent do you actually see a continuous history of the commons as either both an idea or notion of the commons, or as actual demands for or against certain forms of enclosure, particularly as those who are engaged in these popular politics are struggling with identities as commoners, as subjects of empire, and as citizens of emerging nation states.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. No, I mean, that's an important question, this whole very important and vital feature of, I mean, it's especially important in British history since the late 16th century, isn't it, following the history of enclosures and the question of commoning, and it has, and there's a lot of interest, isn't there, in it right now in terms of how people have seen neoliberalism in terms of accumulation by dispossession and attempts to push against that by asserting a common right to forms of, I suppose it's above all about forms of property held in common and collective ownership. Well, the language of commoning of in that tradition isn't you know, an evident or a leading feature of this history as I've read it. But I mean, the way I use the word commoner in the 19th century, it refers to those who are excluded from military, administrative, and fiscal functions, those who are, according to the Ottoman authorities, are supposed to be productive subjects from whom taxes will be extracted. But it's just interesting to note that designation is often, they attempt to transcend it. So that is a rather different sort of instantiation. It doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of struggles over, but often more hidden, over the seizure and acquisition of private wealth and property. I mean, you see this in Mount Lebanon in the 1920s, in Grand Liban, when the French try to prevent foraging in forests, for example. They say it's unproductive. They say, you know, we can't have this, the land has to be, the domain has to be mise en valeur and by a kind of a form of private ownership. And so it excludes attempts to gather firewood and this. I mean, these issues are alive in the region. But in terms of movements that, as their explicit project of announcing an attempt to reclaim the commons, well, that history might be there. I haven't been able to find, you know, major sorts of examples of that. Yes.
Thank you. Hi. That was just a phenomenal overview of the region, I think, for the past 200 years, almost like an entire semester, just very articulately presented. And this looks like will be a tour de force, or if not your magnum opus. So congratulations.
Thank you.
My question is, having not read it yet, the term Pandora's box is just floating in my head a lot right now. And I'm wondering if you ever use that term, or it, meaning, you know, you open the Pandora's box of popular politics, or even common Muslim interpretation of the holy text. All of this is going on, and that these acts can be presented, these popular acts, in a positive light, or in a Pandora's box type light, as look what it has produced. I was wondering if you use that. It, you know, it has the tone of what you called the prose of counterinsurgency, right? I mean, it's a very conservative term, but I wonder if that ever pops up, and how you deal with
that. I don't use that term, but I mean, there's so many cognate possibilities, aren't there? I mean, among conservative Sunni Muslim clerics, the idea of fitna or chaos that is unleashed either by sexual corruption or transgression of the normal lines of authority. I mean, there's a section of the ulama, the religious authorities in 1882, that refused to support Urabi's patriotic and constitutional uprising on the basis that he isn't appointed to be a leader by the Sultan. And so, and the fact that he's usurped that line of authority is enough for them to say this will open the door to chaos. So as you say, it's a very powerful aspect of the language of order, is to, I think it comes up, doesn't it, in the first negative appraisals of 2011, the kind of, that were written very early, the idea that it opens a Pandora's box. And of course, it can be a seductive language, that the chaos, insecurity, the language of fear, etc., etc. So there are so many, there's a very developed prose of counterinsurgency around those issues. I found two sorts of languages. There's the language of purity, and the enemy of purity is corruption. And then there's the language of freedom, and the enemy of freedom is constraint. And I mean, those sorts of languages, they echo through all the evaluations of contentious mobilization and popular politics. Is what's happening disorder? Will it corrupt the social order, or will it free the social order? And there's a seductive view that says, oh, well, freedom and constraint is a Western episteme, and corruption and purity is a kind of an Eastern episteme. Well, I refuse. I think that binary is totally bogus. There are so many socially conservative languages around corruption and purity in the West as well as elsewhere. So, but there, I think that it's very important to bear in mind. It's quite difficult to reconcile those oppositions. They have a very powerful valence across that history.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm interested in the historicity of these movements. I sense almost a cyclical. I get a cyclical experience, and as you talk about the popular uprisings most recently in the region, and then as we've seen similar returns to authoritarianism following these uprisings in certain areas, I'm wondering about the role of human agency and how much you see this factoring in if you were to make a pitch for the way things have the possibility of going in the future.
Okay. Well, yes, the cyclical, in terms of the rise, establishment, maintenance, reform, and then collapse of forms of political hegemony, that indeed has a kind of cyclical moment. I mean, I don't really refer to Ibn Khaldun in the book, but there is something of that kind of idea, for sure, in how political hegemony is established and then how it might come to pieces. So I think it makes sense. I mean, if we're not dealing in teleologies, then perhaps we're dealing in cycles. But having said that, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. But there are lots of interesting similarities between, I mean, especially the latest period and actually the late 19th century is quite interesting. I mean, the late 19th century had liberals without mass constituencies, and it had attempts to form Islamic states against empires and regional opponents. And so does the early 20th century. It has liberals without mass constituencies, and it has attempts to form new Islamic states. So, early 21st century, sorry, yes. So, there is something about that. But in terms of agency, the concepts I use to try to grasp the sorts of active agencies that are at work in the positive construction of mobilizing projects have to do with intellectual labor and intellectual leadership, the appropriation of translocal norms and ideas, forms of practical leadership, organization, strategies and tactics, and different modes of organization, and things and factors having to do with normative commitment, but and a range of features. But I try to insert that sort of social constructionism while paying attention to circumstances transmitted from the past in the terms of the forms of political hegemony, and especially their destructure and contraction that can generate enabling conditions within which those sorts of active agencies can operate. Maybe I'll wait until... yes?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the way that you're using hegemony in this instance. In Gramsci's formulation, hegemony is coordinated through civil society. And when he uses the term civil society, it's a relatively expansive term, but referring to a whole set of institutions and organizations that exist outside of the state itself.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can, there's so many cases that you're dealing with, so I don't know how much you can really generalize, but what is the historical trajectory of the civil society sphere, that kind of outer ring in Gramsci's sense of civil society, that essentially structures the type of hegemony that you're analyzing?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's absolutely important. Projects of moral, political, intellectual leadership, they happen in what Gramsci called the earthworks and redoubts and fortresses of civil society. And he does seem to refer to all the different institutions, churches, media, schools, etc., clubs, organizations, unions that exist between the individual and the state. But the important thing about Gramsci's concept is that civil society, it isn't conceived as this fundamentally autonomous liberal place in which resistance to state power can happen. It's in fact the arena of struggle, right? So that's very important. The thing is, I slightly duck the discussion about civil society in the book because it's a long discussion, because the book, since the 1980s, that term has been used so extensively to mean something which isn't what Gramsci had in mind. In Middle East studies, we had it beginning with Augustus Richard Norton and others, but it's all around, Larry Diamond, democratization studies. And then on, David Held, Mary Kaldor, global civil society. It's a whole cottage industry. So I thought, well, shall I try to say, look, I mean something completely different, or shall I not actually have that debate? But the point is, there are a whole variety of institutions between the individual and the state that are always at stake in hegemonic strategies, and from Sufi orders to guilds to unions to syndicates to fronts to committees to newspapers to press, and they're present throughout the book. They don't play this kind of active shaping role in and of themselves. I'm much more interested in the agencies that work in those earthworks and fortresses, as it were. But so civil society as an analytic concept, it doesn't have a kind of a purchase. Now I like to think that's reasonably faithful to Gramsci, given that he sees it as an arena of struggle rather than as a thing that causes other things to happen. I mean, one of the striking features of the strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood in the interwar period is it looks like a war of position, a war of position in the way meant by Gramsci, that you can't carry out a seizure of state power as Lenin did in Russia. You have to first begin at the level of civil society and create a historic bloc which will then accede to power. And the Muslim Brotherhood sets out quite clearly a strategy which says, to begin with, you perfect the individual. It's the stage of knowledge. And then there's a stage of outreach where you go out, you create organizations, you create clinics, you write in the press, and you persuade everybody else to be a good Muslim like you. And then the third stage is called execution. And actually, I mean, one of the strengths of this strategy is you can do lots of pious good works and be part of it, and without any overt confrontation with the state, without demonstrating, without protesting. But there's a weakness in the strategy, which is actually the phase of execution is never very clearly defined. How is it supposed to happen that this becomes a historic bloc which takes power in the state? It's not clear in the Muslim Brotherhood. Is it going to be an armed struggle or not? And it's not. And so you can clearly see a kind of civil society-based strategy there, and that happens with other movements. But I don't, as I say, I avoid the use of the term just to avoid getting entangled in those debates. Just to clarify on hegemony itself, I mean, there are really three sorts of readings of Gramsci. I mean, one is that hegemony is, it requires a fundamental class, which is linked to the means of production. It's either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, and they hegemonize other subaltern social groups, lumpen proletariat, petty bourgeoisie, the peasantry, in the name of the nation and a project, either of liberalism if it's the bourgeoisie, or the socialism if it's the proletariat. That's one reading, and that's probably most faithful to Gramsci. But then he was reread in a much more discursive way, starting in the 1960s and 70s, and then with what the Clown Move did in the 80s, Stuart Hall and others, and they read hegemony in terms of cultural hegemony, in terms of discursive construction. And that had a link to Foucauldian analysis and on and on. Well, I prefer the third version of Gramsci, not the economistic version, not the discursive version, but the political version. And there's this book by John Sanborn-Napsu, it's called The Postmodern Prince, and he tries to recover a kind of political Gramsci, which is much more about leadership, about domination, the dominant bloc, its articulation with subaltern social groups and their strategies, forms of organization. So that's the kind of, when I'm thinking about hegemony and hegemonic contestation, it's that political Gramsci that I have in mind. But I don't know whether that clarifies or sidesteps or both. Yes.
Thank you very much. Many of the examples and case studies you use take place within well-defined political spheres, the empire or a particular state. But one of the features of the modern world is that I would think that displacement and movement of populations across these boundaries were actually formative forces.
Yeah.
And the Middle East is certainly not short of examples of that.
Yeah.
Whether it's a late 19th century movement of millions of Muslims from the Caucasus or the Balkans, or Crimea, the Armenian genocide, the transfer of populations between Greece and Turkey, the Palestinian expulsion of Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Libya under the Aswan Dam. One can go on for a long time.
Yeah.
How would you figure that into this framework?
Yeah. Well, of course, that's such a vitally important issue, and I myself, I did this study of hundreds of thousands of Syrian migrant workers who moved from Syria to Lebanon and backwards and forwards, especially since the 1960s, doing work in low income and semi and unskilled labor, and that was a book-length study. And so I have been attuned to this important issue of displacement and migration, and I have written an article of 2011 on how circulations of migrants and others brought activist ideas to onto the Arabian Peninsula. Palestinians, Egyptians, Yemenis, and others. They played a role in circulating activist ideas, pan-Arab ideas, and ideas about Arab socialism, Baathism, and so on. So my answer is to say there's no determinate analytic direction. I mean, that I discerned in this book is that it could be one or the other. I mean, displacement, it can circulate ideas that can feed into political projects, or it can cause people to keep their heads down and enter what I characterized in Lebanon as a kind of an invisible cage, whereby you concentrate on sending goods back home to your domestic communities of production, and you thereby get entangled inadvertently in larger structures of accumulation and a kind of a politics that you completely ignore overt confrontation with. But the other interesting thing, though, is another vector, is which again I don't explore in the book, but it's this thing about even a displaced population, when it comes to make claims politically, who does it make claims to? It often has to make claims against its own state. I mean, one example being this underexplored issue of Bangladeshi workers in Kuwait in 2005 when they were protesting. They went on strike, hospital workers. They appealed to the Bangladeshi embassy. They didn't appeal to the Kuwaiti authorities. But because in terms of, and one can understand that partly in terms of how they share a political community with Bangladeshi authorities. They feel completely excluded from Kuwait and they don't have a route to citizenship, and therefore the instantiation of their rights occurs in interaction with Bangladeshi authorities, or at least that's the attempt. So that could be another interesting feature that again I don't explore in the book, but there are a bit, it pops up. I mean, with the cattle herding tribe that is so important in the Mahdia in Sudan, they migrate through from West Africa across to Khartoum and back again, and some of it may be that they some of the tactics that the Mahdi uses are very similar to what the West African jihad movements did. For example, he announces that he's going to undertake a hijra, an emigration from the land of corruption and unbelief in order to establish a purer form of community in order to return. And this was a very marked feature of West African jihad. It's funny, people think that Said Qutb sort of invented that idea, but he didn't. There are these others back in the 19th, even 18th century who were thinking in those terms. Of course, you have those in South Asia as well, Hijra movements. There was one in Tlemcen in 1911 as well. But I mean, there's probably a whole rich field of things to be said about displacements that aren't tackled in a book that's probably full of other sorts of sins of omission. Yes.
So at a number of points in your talk, you talked about these popular political movements as unruly. And then towards the end of the talk, you spoke about the importance of commitment in these. And I'm wondering if you might unpack a certain tension in the way in which you've described them, and whether to link that to the question about Gramsci, whether that there might be an alternative to the political Gramsci, and that might be Gandhi, in thinking about how popular politics works.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that's an important. It's an important, definitely an important question. I think I see what you're getting at as well. I do. I've been recently reading Sean Chabot and someone called Doivendak on Gandhi, and one of the interesting features of what Gandhi was up to is a very deeply articulated project of intellectual labour. I don't want to colonize Gandhi with my own terms, but I mean, it's very highly developed, the ideas of what it means to engage in a kind of resistance that doesn't involve, it's not just sort of non-violent resistance, isn't it marvelous? It's a kind of a whole developed theory about how you acquire dignity and how you, I can't articulate the whole thing right now, but it struck me that there's a lot of intellectual labour going on in terms of what Gandhi enunciated. So I don't necessarily see that as, I mean, of course I'd have to do more study, but it doesn't seem to me prima facie as a sort of a contradiction. But on the other side, I think you do sort of point to something important, which is that there's a vector of transgressive and unruly mobilization, and there's another vector, which I borrow this term from McAdam, Tarrow and Tilley, which is contained mobilization, which has to do with what happens when patterns of mobilization become more routinized. What happens when the political subject is more established, and you expect a strike, you expect a letter writing campaign, you expect a petition, or even something else. You might even expect a certain pattern of crowd action, for example. So that's there, and I do try to distinguish that throughout the book, and it's not necessarily the case that unruly and transgressive mobilization it can be quite ephemeral. And there are lots of examples of that. I mean, one is the Cairo fire of January 1952. And it's interesting because people that do it do very particular and structured things. What happens is the main symbols of colonial power and wealth in downtown Cairo are burnt by the crowd when it becomes apparent that King Farouk is not going to do anything about the death of the 50 Egyptian policemen in the barracks in Ismailia. And so the crowd, it goes to Farouk's palace, he's banqueting, and he has his troops shoot on the crowd. And in response to that, they start this burning. But it's forensic. They remove goods from shops, pile them in the middle of the street, deliberately leave them on one side, and then burn the shops, and to show they're not looters. So it's spontaneous, but very... but then there are looters who show up at the end of the day. But it's the Pandora's box, I suppose. But so even in those vectors of unruliness, you get patterns as well. So it's a tricky business. But the Intifada in Egypt in January 19th, 20th, 1977, it rises up, it lasts 2 days, and then it subsides and nothing happens. And so, yes, it was unruly, but then there wasn't the continuity, there wasn't the organisation, and there wasn't much intellectual labour around it either from Islamists or leftists. The leftists tried to wash their hands of it, the Islamists weren't very interested. Quite unlike Algeria in 1988, where following the crowd actions of the young men, the Islamists show up and they start to hegemonize the crowds according to their own sorts of projects. So there's an intermeshing of unruly and transgressive vectors and then more contained vectors that are quite difficult to sort of empirically reify or pull apart in practice. But I think we have to also, on the other side, find ways to analyze the unruly vectors because they have to do with creativity and unexpectedness and how that can create a change, whereas the more contained forms are more anticipated and so on. But of course, it doesn't mean that there's a conclusion about which one is, as it were, more effective, more successful, and so on and so forth. I don't try to conclude that debate in the book.
I know that we're running out of time, but the $1 million question is, so now what, after 2011?
Yeah. Well, now what? There's definitely multiple crises of authority. The regimes that are still in place in places like Syria or Egypt or Algeria, or insofar as they are, they're not distinguished by the strong forms of consent or hegemony. So the expectation is that there will be projects which are both unruly and contained in that context. That's the expectation as far as I'm concerned. But, for all the counter-revolutionary capacity of the Sisi's state in Egypt, the fact that it's locked up tens of thousands of Islamists and thrown in the revolutionary youth as well and carried out some of the largest massacres in the civilians that Egypt has seen in August 2013, you have to go a long way back in history before you find something similar as what was done on August the 14th in Egypt 2013. But for all those powers, it was the case that domestic regimes were overthrown in 4 cases, or at least dictators were toppled, and quite decisively in 2 cases, Tunisia and Egypt at least for a time, and that's quite a dramatic event, and that doesn't, the memory of that, or that indicates is not something that will just sort of disappear anytime soon. So, but a lot depends on leadership, depends on agency, depends on intellectual labor, depends on people's commitments. So it's open-ended, and we have to also expect the unexpected, and that's also a lesson of unruly collective action, is that it's hopeless to predict. Suddenly something will happen. If it's true that there are comparisons between this period and the period that just preceded the First World War, if it's true, then, but the First World War sort of intervened, but it meant that reformist liberal nationalists were able to then hegemonize much wider constituencies, at least in Egypt. And but who could have predicted that that was what would happen? And so there could be intervening exogenous factors that then create whole new alignments, which are generative. I mean, think of Charles Anderson's 1,100-page PhD on resistance in Mandate Palestine. He speaks about the uprising of 1936 to 39 as a generative alignment. I think it's a very eloquent way of putting it. And there can be new generative alignments that create unpredictable constellations that it's hopeless to sit here and try to imagine what they would be. But that's, which is, you know, part of the fascination of the topic. Whereas I think we can specify enabling conditions for how action can find propitious circumstances, but I don't think we know what shape it takes. I'm not someone who says it's absolutely unpredictable in the way of Kurzman. I think we can expect, in this context, new sorts of projects. But I suppose one has to remain suitably cautious about what they would be.
We're out of time. I was going to say, how does Turkey fit into this? Because I didn't hear examples from.
Yes, well, that's an important question. I mean, I look at the history of the Ottoman Empire until the First World War, and then the focus of the book is on the Arab states, and the main reason for that has to do with my linguistic capabilities. So that's how. But it's an important question because Turkey really is part of the picture, and especially now more so than ever before, and someone else will have to take on the task of figuring that out.
You got enough there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and for that engagement and those important questions.